La sessió d'avui ens la farà la doctora Vally Lytra. La doctora Lytra és professora titular de Llengües de l'Educació al Departament d'Estudis de l'Educació a Goldsmiths University of London. El fil conductor de les seves recerques han estat el bilingüisme i la bialfabetització, tant a la llar com a l'escola, com sobretot en les comunitats que han experimentat fluxos migratoris. El seu treball es caracteritza per una visió dinàmica del llenguatge, la cultura i la identitat, i planteja la necessitat d'entendre i d'utilitzar el bilingüisme i la bialfabetització com un recurs per crear entorns educatius inclusius. És autora de diversos treballs, fruit de les seves experiències en centres educatius grecs, danesos, bretons i anglesos, entre d'altres. En el context que avui ens ocupa, parteix de la premissa que l'alfabetització en la fe o en la religió és important i rellevant en els processos educatius dels infants i dels joves i reflexionarà sobre el paper de les creences religioses com a eina d'aprenentatge, de socialització i d'identificació tant personal com col·lectiva per als joves en les ciutats globals. Tenint en compte que la religió o la fe és una força motriu fonamental a tot el món, considera que la investigació acadèmica hi ha prestat una atenció molt limitada, igual que l'escola i la societat, que sovint tendeixen a ignorar o a menysprear la incidència de la fe o de la religió en l'èxit educatiu dels joves, en el seu procés de socialització i en el desenvolupament de la seva identitat, comparant-la negativament amb els processos d'aprenentatge escolar. Durant la seva intervenció, doncs, ens mostrarà exemples de com l'alfabetització, el literacy, que és aquesta paraula tan difícil de traduir al català, la literacy religiosa, afavoreix l'aprenentatge de llengües, l'aprenentatge en general i de llengües en especial, i incrementa les expectatives d'èxit educatiu, desenvolupa un sentit de comunitat i de pertinença, i quan els joves participen diàriament en activitats als llocs de culte, a casa o a les classes d'educació religiosa, s'afavoreix la interiorització d'identitats positives. També ens qüestionarà alguns plantejaments...
She will also question some consolidated thoughts, at least at home, in respect to the learning in religious context, emphasizing the richness of the importance of origins and identities when learning, with the objective of working collectively in favor of more plural and democratic systems of education. Dr. Lytra, the floor is yours.
So, first of all, I would like to... Thank you. Yes. So first of all, I'd like in turn to thank our hosts here at Linguapax, particularly Monica, Alícia and Amélie for their very kind invitation and warm hospitality. It's a real pleasure to be back in Barcelona. I was here in July for the Ethnography and Education conference that was hosted at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and I was once again at the receiving end of such warm hospitality. So I'm very pleased to be here today. And my contribution is going to be from the field of education, and in particular language education. And we've heard two speakers so far coming from different disciplinary perspectives. And I think what our work really shows is the true interdisciplinary nature of research in religion, religious traditions and language. So I would like to start my presentation with a little story, a personal story. And it kind of goes like this. Last May, I had gone to my children's school. My 11-year-old daughter had forgotten her lunch at home, so I had to drive to school to drop off the lunch for her. So when I went to school, I saw her class teacher, Mr. A, and we started chatting. I don't quite remember how we started talking about the role of faith in children's language and literacy development, but I distinctly remember his remark that he had never really thought about the relevance or importance of faith in children's learning. Now, Mr. A is a very thoughtful teacher who encourages his students to ask questions and discover knowledge. So later that day, Mr. A sent me the following email, and you've got it here on the PowerPoint. So hi again. Interesting, and coincidentally, just after you left, a classmate wrote this. What does this small action idea make you understand about our central idea? It makes me think that anyone can make a difference, no matter what age, race, gender, or nationality. It shows us that there are more important things than ourselves, and that no one should be alone in the world. We were not made to be alone. We were made so that we could comfort, not kill, so that we could heal, not hurt, and so that we could help our earth become the better, cleaner, kinder earth that God created it to be. Juan Man's story shows us that no one should suffer being alone. We're all humans, we're all equal. We are all his creations, and he blessed each and every one of us differently, but all the same, he blessed each and every one of us. I think that the Free Hugs campaign was a small bit, but it helped the people he hugged and the people who saw and cared. So, funny time, no? So, of course, I was thrilled to receive this message from him. And just to give a little bit of background to what the child is referring to, they had been discussing the Free Hugs movement. I don't know whether you're familiar with this movement. It sprang up around 2004 in Australia. It was initiated in Sydney by a man called Juan Man, who started giving hugs in his local shopping mall. What's really amazing about this is that this spearheaded, if you like, the single actions of a single person, spurred by the realization that people were having increasingly disconnected lives and wanted to do something about it. So the idea caught on. It really caught hold of people's imaginations and spread across the globe. So the children at the time, they were talking about how the actions of a single person could affect the lives of so many. And that was part of their unit of inquiry. Through small actions, everyone can make an impact. So what struck me as an educator when I read the child's response was how powerful and personal it was, how she was using a religious frame to make sense of her academic learning, in this case reflecting upon the story of Juan Man, which was related to a particular unit and her evaluation of his actions. I was particularly struck by the language, how in my eyes, in the eyes of a Greek Orthodox, it resembled a sermon. And I quote, "We were not made to be alone. We were made so that we could comfort, not kill, so that we could heal, not hurt, so that we could help our earth become the better, cleaner, kinder earth that God created it to be." But also, what this very short piece of writing revealed about the child's sense of self, how their faith seemed to be central to the understanding and interpretation of the world and their place within it. And I think that links very nicely to our first speaker, who talked about the importance of looking at faith and language within relationships. It's impossible to see it in isolation. And she talks about how we are all his creations, and he blessed each and every one of us differently, but all the same, he blessed each and every one of us. So as an educator, I pondered the question that if we are to build our pedagogies, so our kind of teaching and learning methodologies, drawing on all children's linguistic, cultural, and social resources, surely we cannot ignore children's faith literacies, nor consider them irrelevant to their school learning. As we saw in the child's reflections, for many children around the world, these are important resources for learning and identification that cut across home, school, and community. But what do we really know about children's faith-related resources and literacies? Well, we do know that faith underpins the everyday experiences of many children and adults. Faith has been viewed as an important source of support, comfort, and hope as people navigate the challenges and opportunities of a globalized world and participate in multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith societies. Now, this is especially true for individuals and communities that that are new to a country or are experiencing hardship and discrimination. And there's quite a significant body of work within literacy studies that has examined the role of the Black church in the US, for instance, in fostering resilience and inspiring educational effort among African American youth. And similarly, there's been quite a lot of work with Latino children and families, also in the US, where religion is seen as an important source of spiritual and material support to resist the racism and marginalization that many face in their daily lives. Some faith communities are majority ones, while others are minority religions, and they have been formed at different historical periods as a consequence of migration, trade, colonialism, slavery, or religious persecution. Yet our own work on faith literacies revealed that empirical studies, so studies that focus on how children and families engage with their faith literacies in their everyday lives, and the role of faith in children's learning, socialization, and identification, has actually received very little attention in the social sciences and in education in particular. So within education, most often than not, schooling and wider society tend to ignore or disparage the role of faith in children's educational achievement, socialization, and identity development, or unfavorably compare it to that of school literacies. Mr. A's remark that he had never really thought about the relevance or importance of faith in children's learning is, to my mind, indicative of many teachers' stance towards faith literacies. This educator's stance is compounded by the fact that faith is often perceived as very private, a very private but deeply personal matter. It's often anchored in the belief that only if one is a member of a faith community, one can truly understand the religious rituals and sacred texts. These widely held perceptions have been heightened by the secularization of social life and the compartmentalization of the secular and the religious, the public and private spheres in many contemporary societies around the world. But at the same time, there's also a realization of what other scholars have talked about in terms of the entanglement, the kind of quite strong ties of the secular and the religious, pointing to the existence of more porous and fluid boundaries. So rather than ignoring or disparaging faith literacies in our work, we view faith as an essential part of culture, a complex and multifaceted cultural practice that is embedded in specific sociocultural, historical, and political contexts. So it ties in very nicely to what our previous speaker was talking about in terms of the importance of understanding the historical context of how religion and language interconnect. And faith is passed down from one generation to the next, so there's a strong intergenerational aspect, providing children and adults with membership and a sense of belonging. Again, the idea of connectedness that was highlighted by the first speaker, and relationships. It's about forming relationships between the child or the adult and a higher being, but also relationships between the members of the faith community. So in this respect, becoming a member of the faith community does not only involve acquiring the necessary language and literacy-orientated skills to decode, recite, listen, respond to, chant or sing sacred texts in order to become part of the religious community. But also, as we saw in the child's reflections at the beginning, it's about ways of being, ways of acting, and ways of seeing the world through religious frames of understanding, interpretation, and belonging. And I use frames in the plural because there's not one religious frame, but there are many, and within, both within and across different faith traditions. So faith learning has an additional moral and spiritual dimension that distinguishes its purpose from learning in other contexts. As I mentioned a minute ago, the knowledge and competencies and performances that the child learns and perfects over time are the means of partaking in religious ritual with the purpose of ultimately building a relationship with a higher and eternal being. So with these broader debates in mind, we embarked on the BeLiFS project. Our study was called Becoming Literate in Faith Settings, Language and Literacy Learning in the Lives of New Londoners, which looked at 16 children aged between 4 and 12 when we started the fieldwork, from Bangladeshi Muslim, Ghanaian Pentecostal, Polish Catholic, and Tamil Hindu communities. And we looked at how these children were becoming literate through their faith activities in London. Very briefly, this is our research team. We were 11 researchers sharing different linguistic, cultural, ethnic backgrounds, gender, age, religious and non-religious beliefs. We worked with 4 families from each of the faith communities, the faith leaders, faith teachers, as well as older members of the communities. And these are the research questions that we sought to answer. So we were very much interested in the scope and nature of literacy practices in each setting, the kind of teaching and learning that was taking place in religious education classes, but also in the home. And we're also interested in change, so how faith literacy practices change over time in the London setting and across generations. And finally, how participation in faith literacies contributes to the development of individual and collective identities. We collected, as you can imagine, over a 3-year period, quite a lot of data and a wide range of data. But perhaps I should say here that our primary concern when we were doing the field work was really to make the children's experiences, perspectives, and understandings visible and audible. And I'll show you some examples for this. We encourage children to use visual as well as verbal ways of sharing and representing their experiences of becoming literate through faith and what this meant for them. So in the remaining of my talk, I will focus on one of the 4 faith communities, the Tamil Hindu Saiva community. The reason why I will do that is because that's the community I worked most closely with. Saivaism is a branch of Hinduism. Saivites believe that Lord Shiva is the ultimate deity, and all other deities are avatars of him, in other words, incarnations or manifestations of God. So just very briefly about the Sri Lankan Tamil migration to the UK. So the first migration wave started right after Sri Lankan independence from British rule in the late 1940s. It was followed by the introduction of discriminatory measures against the Tamil minority by the Sinhalese-dominated majority. And these measures gathered momentum in the 1960s, which resulted in what many of you might know, the Civil War in 1983, and that led to the mass exodus of Tamils. Many of them fled their homes, and many of them arrived to the UK as refugees, or the UK was their ultimate destination through other European countries, first as refugees and then to the UK. there are no really official statistics about the number of the UK Tamil population. It's estimated somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000, and the majority live in London. I would like to stress here that while there are important differences in terms of education, socioeconomic status, political and religious affiliation between and within the different migration cohorts, which have caused tensions, Sri Lankan Tamils have been united in their desire to preserve and keep alive their contested language, culture, and identity in the diaspora. And in their efforts, they have created quite a lot of community organizations, Tamil schools, and temples. I'd like to show you some examples of the faith literacy practices the children engaged in. The first example comes from a scrapbook entry one of the children created for the project. And just to give you a little bit of background of the creation of the scrapbooks, at the beginning of the second year of the project, we gave each child an A4 size scrapbook with multicolored pages, and we asked the children to write, draw, and stick in it whatever they considered important about their faith and they wanted to share with us. And here are some examples of the scrapbooks, and then they're accompanied by photographs that the children took for us. I'll just go over them very quickly to give you a sense of the kind of artistic, aesthetic, but also linguistic, I'll show you, and cultural knowledge. And I just want to focus on one particular scrapbook entry and talk to you a little bit more about that, because it deals, that, if you like, in a more direct way with the issue of language and literacy. That is the focus of my talk. This particular entry was done by a 9-year-old girl called Chantia, and she entitled it, "Why Do Hindus Consider Om Sacred?" So she created this 2-page spread. On the one hand, she created a Tamil Om, and on the other hand, she created a Sanskrit Om in the middle, and she has an explanatory text where she talks about the significance of Om for Hindus. In other words, what the meaning of the sacred sound is. So I can read the explanatory text for you. I don't know if you can see it very clearly. Can you see it? No. Well, she says, Om is the source of all religions and religious traditions. The syllable A carries mankind like a horse. The syllable U is a pointer to the condition and location. The syllable M is indicative of the rhythm and melody of life. Om is sacred due to all these qualities. Therefore, chanting Om is a purifying experience for all Hindus. It is said to be a great source of happiness. Nowadays, it is also written as Om. Here are the qualities of Om. And she has happiness, auspicious, solemn, mystical, melodical, powerful, pure, and sacred. Okay. So when we're looking at Xanthia's text making, we immediately recognize the rich visual imagery of Hinduism. And how she was drawing upon that to juxtapose and combine different linguistic and scriptural and aesthetic resources, genres and cultural threads from diverse sources. So on the one hand, we have the crafting of the explanatory text that alludes to the school genre of explanatory writing, whose purpose is to convey information clearly and accurately. And we know that many children like Chantia and her brother used this kind of writing genre for the purposes of the scrapbooks to really explain the knowledge of Hinduism to a less informed audience and combine this information with their own faith knowledge and experience. But also what we found interesting in her text making was how she personalized her entry. You can see the little pictorial representations of the qualities of Om, the spirals and the hearts. So when we're looking at this text making, for us, what we saw was how the child was drawing upon and syncretizing her knowledge of different languages and scripts. So she's using English, she's using Sanskrit, she's using Tamil script. And undeniably, English was her strongest language. It's a language she uses to convey information and express her feelings and experiences about her faith. Tamil was very much a living language for her. She uses it to communicate with her parents and grandparents. She's also learning how to read and write it in Tamil school and in religious education classes afterwards. Tamil is also the devotional language of Tamils, and it's used almost exclusively in temple worship. Now, Xanthia's knowledge of Sanskrit, the liturgical language of Hinduism, was restricted to certain prayers that she had learned to recite without really fully comprehending their meaning. So we see how through these scrapbook entries, children strategically use Tamil and a few instances of Sanskrit to refer to auspicious celebrations, religious and cultural concepts or names of God, titles of their faith stories. And in most cases, they transliterated Tamil words into English, but occasionally they used Tamil and Sanskrit scripts, as in the examples that I presented. So as I mentioned earlier, at the end of this one-year project with the scrapbooks, the researcher went through the scrapbook together with the children. In this case, it was Xanthia and her brother who had worked together on this. And I'd like to just play a little bit of a conversation that the researcher had with the children, where they leafed through the scrapbook, and she got the kids to talk about what they had drawn or written and how that related to their understanding of faith. So you'll see in the way that it's an interview that's very much co-constructed. There's a sense of shared understanding and membership between the researcher and the two children. So let's. Okay. Sorry, I'll have to play it externally. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, so now you've drawn a literary Tamil form, and we've explained about form. Did you get this from the book as well, that same book, yeah? Okay, so explain to me, why do we have a Tamil form? Why do we have a different form to this form? Yeah.
Can you hear?
And what have you learned about it all?
Can you not? It's okay. I'll tell them what they talk about. Yeah.
That's really good. But how do you feel when you sing? Do you agree? Do you feel the same thing when you chant along?
Yeah, it's like sense vibration.
Yeah, exactly. What about you, Chantia? Do you always sing? Yeah. Relaxing. So,
Okay. All right. So I would like just to draw your attention to 2 points. One of the things that the child mentions is the relationship between language and identity. So she talks about the Tamil Om being our Om. And the researcher reinforces that. So we see this link between the ethnic identity and Tamil language. The other point I'd like to make has to do with the way that the children use this opportunity to explain to the researcher what they understand a highly metaphysical concept means to them. Chantia talks about Om as sending vibrations and creating this calming effect. It's the sound that created the world. So we see that the children go through this process of recontextualization, if you like. And these recontextualizations, they're on the one hand highly scripted in the sense that they have learned through the religious socialization how to talk about their personal interpretations of the meanings of the sacred sounds in ways that are appropriate to their faith. So a similar, if you like, syncretizing of linguistic resources, drawing on literate forms of Sanskrit and English, was also evident in an example of prayers that the child Chantia recorded for us, and it's a morning prayer. And what we found quite interesting was that it was actually a bilingual prayer. Part of the prayer is in Sanskrit and part of it is in English. I think what, I'll play the prayer for you in a moment, but I think what for us was particularly interesting, that although we focus on language as a meaning-making resource to examine faith literacies, we're also interested in the relationship between language and other communicative modalities, gesture, body posture, image, as well as the materiality and technological dimensions of these practices. And I'll just play the prayer for you. Just get out of here. I'll finish, yeah. I think what I was trying to show here is that actually faith literacies is about language, but it's more than language. It's the multimodal and sensory aspects, if you like, dimensions that are equally important, and they complement the linguistic. So although, as you know, previous speakers focused on the linguistic, we're trying to say that the linguistic is important, but there are also other modes, if you like, that interanimate. Let me I just want to conclude very quickly. These were just perhaps. Yes, so I trust that the examples I presented to you today illustrated the importance of investigating children's faith literacies. So my argument has been, and that of other educators looking at faith literacies, and rather than ignoring the role of faith and faith literacies, our work foregrounds the sense of membership and belonging children develop in the context of their respective faith communities. So while becoming socialized into the rules for participation and engagement in their respective faith communities, appropriate dispositions and emotional responses, religious and cultural heritage and histories, they also learn to navigate multilingual and multicultural spaces bringing together and syncretizing different sets of linguistic and cultural resources. So the idea that children flexibly draw on their different linguistic resources was also something that was reiterated by the faith teachers that we talked with. And one of them in particular stressed the importance of using both languages in religious education. And he sort of put it that, you know, if children don't understand the religious concepts, then they won't be able to gain full membership in the faith community, and they will lose interest. So the argument really was that the religious curriculum would need to be taught, drawing on the children's full linguistic repertoire. In other words, different forms of vernacular and literate Tamil. And this was seen as a rather pragmatic and contextual response to the heterogeneous language and literacy competencies of the children growing up in a diasporic context. The teacher's reflections that you can see on the PowerPoint indicated an awareness of the cognitive and linguistic demands faith literacy learning places on children to access the religious curriculum in Tamil only. His reflections also illustrated a recognition that while Tamil School had been set up to maintain and promote a persecuted language, culture and identity in the country of origin, Sri Lanka, the main focus of faith lessons in contemporary London was not Tamil language and literacy development per se. Through learning about faith, children enhanced receptive and productive abilities in oral and written forms of Tamil too. But the main focus of the faith lessons, as I mentioned earlier, was the development of their knowledge of the principles, beliefs, and values of Hinduism, Saivism, embedded in Tamil culture and history, and to really help children make sense of highly symbolic and metaphysical concepts by relating them to their own lives in present-day London through a process of recontextualization. And just to conclude, in the current climate of political, social, and religious tensions, where media portrayals often stereotype or misrepresent the experiences of members of minority faith communities or privilege dominant narratives of majority communities, our work brings to the forth the wealth and complexity of languages, literacies, heritages, and identities in faith settings in London. We believe that it is critical to listen to, learn and seek to understand from the children, their families and faith communities, and to avoid stereotypes and dismissive or essentializing generalizations. For educators in particular, if we truly believe that an equitable education is the right of all students, then we must inquire into the teaching and learning practices in the so-called out-of-school context that are most meaningful to children's lives, religious spaces being some of the most important ones. We hope that our work has taken a small step in this direction, urging us to engage in dialogue and work collectively towards more pluralistic, democratic, and equitable societies. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lytra. Many questions have come to my head, but we are running out of time, so I will allow just one question from the audience before the next presentation, because we are very late. I'm sorry. ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿No hi ha preguntes? Doncs aleshores ho deixem aquí. Oh, perdó.
Hola, bon dia. Una mica el que em suggereix aquesta exposició és que en el món aquest que ens ha descrit en Jordi Pigem abans, de la reificació i de la cosifització, se'm fa difícil imaginar en una aula el respecte a aquesta diversitat.
Respect for this diversity, for this religious diversity.
Perquè una mica el que oferim
mainly because what what now the Western world is offering, I think at last in Catalonia, is that everything teaching is becoming a lay issue, laicism, not relating things to belief. So I understand the respect for this diversity, the respect regarding this idea of faith, which is now coming from abroad now to Catalonia, because faith itself, or Christian faith, lacks prestige now socially. And it's difficult for me to understand that or to comprehend this respect for diversity without respecting our own identity. Well, I don't. Maybe I wasn't too clear, but that's my reflection.
Okay. All right. Okay. So it's not really, it's more of a reflection that you'd like to share. I mean, I understand, I completely understand what you're saying. The sort of reflection that you shared with us has been shared by many educators. They say, for instance, in a classroom where you have many children from different faith backgrounds, you know, how do I deal with that? And perhaps what we're trying to do with our work is not so much, we're not advocating, you know, X or Y faith should be taught. But what we're saying is that as educators, we can create spaces in our classrooms where, if children wish, they can bring a religious frame, as the child did in the first slide, to make sense of her learning. Perhaps in another classroom where the teacher was less open to children kind of bringing in their own experiences to interpret academic learning, this wouldn't have happened. I mean, you know, so what we're really saying is that it's first of all creating an awareness that this is an important resource, faith, and it has a potential for learning. And we have all these examples in out-of-school learning. So, of course, the next question is, how do we prepare educators to tackle the religious diversity in their classrooms? I mean, one of the issues is that there's very little knowledge among educators about religions and religious beliefs, or the historical, the political, the cultural context of the different religious traditions, and also how these have changed and have adapted in local context. So there's a broader issue here about religious literacy. So how do we all as a society become religiously literate to be able then to engage in these sorts of conversations? And for us, you know, I think the first step is to recognize these resources and then open spaces within schools where these resources can be brought in. So I hope that's kind of answering your question. Yeah.
Gràcies. Podríem obrir un debat enorme I superinteressant. És un tema
very interesting discussion on this.
sensible.
It's a very sensitive issue, but it's also very important, which is now being dealt with. There's a document by the Catalonian School Council, which is now opening the door to this kind of actions, or at least taking them into account in the education model. So we could be debating, we could be discussing this a long time. Maybe we will focus on this in the future, but now we will have the panel discussion with representatives from different organizations representing different cultures and religions in the city of Barcelona, which will be moderated by Mercè Solé.
Bé, doncs, gràcies per seguir aquí. Com deia ara la Mònica, no? Perdó. Bé, gràcies per seguir aquí.
Thank you for still being here. As Monica was saying, in a meeting like this, focusing on diversity, we wanted to give the floor to the speakers. And now it's time that they talk about their experience, their religious practice. We're aware of the limitations we have for this panel. They will introduce themselves and we'll see how they do this practice, both internally and externally. As Dr. Pijem said, we're aware of the limitation because the diversity now in the city is quite more extensive. And we're aware that there's a limitation, but maybe in the future we'll have the chance to expand the view and have more voices. Both today and yesterday, Professor Austin and Mr. Pijem talked about languages and health or welfare, and we think that this is a good example for this welfare, shared religious practice in a community or both, or inside of us. So we thought that it was now relevant to present these different ways to present us to the world, to conceive and live communication and human expression and the relationship between language, the body and the mind, the mystery of the word, as we have previously discussed. And we want to see how these practices, these individual and collective experiences coexist, sometimes in a visible way, others in an invisible way, in a 21st century city like Barcelona. So this is why we'll try to have a discussion. Before introducing the members of the panel that we have invited, I would like to thank you not just for your presence, but also Núria Gallard from the Religious Affairs Office from the Town Council of Barcelona, and Enric Vendrell, the General Director of Religious Affairs of the Government of Catalonia. So thank you for your attendance. Now I'll introduce the speakers. So we'll keep talking about different topics. We'll be self-moderated. Now I'll introduce them as they want it, and we'll start dealing with different topics. So to the far left, we have Montse Castellà. She's a translator of Buddhist texts. She has been a member of the research group of the Universitat Autònoma on cultural transfer and translation of Tibetan Buddhism. She's the founder and vice president of the Catalan coordinating entity of Buddhist entities, and she's a president of the UNESCO Association for Interreligious Dialogue. Many of them are members of the same entity. Then we have Gagandeep Khalsa. He was born in Amritsar. He trained in IT, but he's been in Catalonia since 2008. He has worked in Badalona and Barcelona. He speaks 7 languages. He has worked as a teacher in Catalan in the Town Council of Barcelona, and now does multicultural mediation. He has written the book The 5 Rivers in Catalonia to introduce his community here. And I think that he got the award, Martí Gasull Award, in 2016. Then we have Mustapha Aoulad Sellam. He has a degree in physical sciences, master in analysis and intervention in social conflict, and postgraduate in the Autonomous University. He has worked in the Office of Religious Affairs, etc. He has participated in many studies. Recently, the diagnostic study on the relevance of Islamophobic practice and discourse. He has been a coordinator of some of the projects in the city of Barcelona. Currently, he's a coordinator for several actions in the plan, and he's a president of the association Stop to Islamophobic Phenomenon, and also he works in the Islam for Barcelona Association for a City Without Hate. Then Jorge Burdman, who's an educator responsible for interreligious dialogue of the Israelite community in Barcelona. He's a member of the UNESCO Association for Interreligious Dialogue and volunteer work for mediation and social work. So we have already met sometimes to discuss, and after the previous presentation, we thought a good way to start would be to see how this transfer is done in families, how and when children learn the language. Because sometimes it's not the language of the place, but it's the language of the community, of the family. Maybe the family has a language and the religious practice has a different language. So let's start talking about the learning of the language. So they'll be speaking and self-moderating. So who'd like to start?
Molt bon dia a tothom. Molt bon dia a tothom. Moltíssimes gràcies.
Good morning. I would like to thank Linguapax for inviting me. I'm really glad. So, what Mercè Solé was talking about the transfer of language to children as a Singh, this is a community which is quite unknown in European countries, but our language is Punjabi. And we, at home, we use Punjabi, but we use Gurdwara. Gurdwara is a Sikh temple where we have our sacred book, Guru Granth. And it's a different language, Gurmukhi. It has nothing to do with the language we speak. So when we learn our mother tongue, but apart from this, Sikhs learn the language of the sacred book, Guru Granth. And the third thing is that the language we speak at home. Well, I remember from when I was a child, for example, water, we say at home we call it pani, but not in Gurdwara, it's jal. So we cannot say jal at home, but it's the same. It's the same. We cannot call water jal at home because it belongs to Gurdwara, but at home we don't call it pani because it's outside of Gurdwara, but it's the same thing, but not just the water, it's just an example. And when in Gurdwara, I said, I want pani, but my mother told me, no, not pani, it's jal. I didn't understand it, but this is what happens to many Sikhs, especially children. But not just water, but also bread, prashapta. In Gurdwara, it has a name, and at home it had a different name. But water, well, we say it's pani or Gurdwara jal, but when it's beside the sacred book, to us, this is not just the sacred book, Guru Bibim, but when it's next to it, the water is next to it, it means a different word. It's sacred or holy water. It has a different name. So the language we use in Gurdwara is Punjabi. When we're not praying, we're not reading the sacred book, but the vocabulary we have in Gurdwara is completely different to the one we use outside of Gurdwara. The language is the same, but they have a different name depending on if we use it at home or if it's Gurdwara. Yes, in the case of Buddhist communities, the situation is completely different. In Buddhist communities, the interest to learn the original language is very important, but just to get more knowledge about the texts or understand what we're saying. And this is completely related to the This is related to dimensional or the spiritual dimension. Here, the thing is completely different. It's not what you were mentioning.
Bueno, buen día a tothom. Moltes gràcies a l'associació Linguapax.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to congratulate Linguapax for their 30th anniversary. So, I was born in Argentina, so they spoke Spanish at home, but my parents came from Eastern Europe. They spoke Yiddish, which is like a German of the 15th century, and also we speak Hebrew in the synagogues. It was used for study, for prayer, in studying prayer, but this is a language we have used academically in schools. But now I also speak Catalan. But when we didn't have a proper conduct, the language was that our parents were not smiling. That was dangerous. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Hello. I would like to thank Linguapax and Alícia for inviting us. I don't know where to start, because usually Arabic and Islam go hand in hand. Everyone should learn. If everyone learns Arabic, then they understand Islam, but that's not true. Well, they go hand in hand as a vehicle, but it's not the case that the Arabic imposes itself where Islam is. So this entails linguistic diversity when we talk about the relationship of people with Islam and the religious practice. But as was mentioned before, religious literacy is done differently in each family. Each family has its own way, but usually this is done orally. We see no families that teach their children with a blackboard or a computer how they should be praying, but this is continuously. This is conveyed orally. But often in minority contexts, like in Barcelona, this is supported by the activities of authorities, religious authorities, or other kinds of authorities. There are several things which are done to teach Arab or the Quran, and to teach at a good level has to do with topics that are included in the Quran. But for example, there are things which have to be done mandatorily in the religion, like prayer, salat. This comes from the word in the Arab word, which means to communicate. So this has to be done in standard Arab, Arabic language, and you have to learn the verses to pray, but otherwise it can be done in the different languages or dialects, because as you know, many countries use dialects, not just standard language, and there are many dialects, for example, in the case of Morocco. So these complicates a little bit this task of transmitting knowledge or the knowledge about religion. Yeah, thinking about how this knowledge is transferred from the perspective of the situation of Buddhism or the context of Buddhism. It is said that in the 7th century, that was the time when Buddhism arrived in Tibet. But previously, the Tibetan language, well, it was specifically designed to be able to translate all these from Sanskrit to another language, so that language in Tibet was specifically designed to introduce Buddhism coming from India to Tibet. But back then, they said that great scholars went to India to find those fundamental texts, to take them to Tibet and translate them. And, well, they went to look for these fundamental texts, and it is said that they were wise people. They were people who had already developed or who could really understand what the texts were saying. So that was a big difference as a translator. And, well, really, in the research group I've been working in, we were facing this challenge that we were not wise. So we wanted to see to what extent we could translate not just the word, as Jordi was talking about. It's not, we're not translating a sum of words, but the spirit, what's being conveyed. There's an intangible dimension or indescribable, and taking into account the recipients, how we will receive the word, how we will interpret it, and the idea we'll get from the word. We have to take into account also the recipient, not just the word, the literal word. A literal translation is a very poor translation. You have to find the gist and to convey it with the necessary words. So we developed a database, a tool that translators can use, and we translate it based on concepts, not just words, because the cosmological vision or the perception of reality of Buddhism is different from ours. So sometimes a word should be explained. It cannot be translated literally. So it has to do with conveying the meaning. It's a whole challenge in itself. Yeah, that's funny because we see that in all religions. For example, in the language of sacred texts, Buddhism in Punjabi or Arabic or Hebrew, words are concepts, as Professor Pijem was saying. They're like ideograms. Each word has to reflect a concept. So, well, so there, as we see here, there's a high religious diversity in Catalonia. Well, it's good to know, after all the talk now there's about the religious coexistence and what's happening with the government and town council. Well, maybe that's new for an audience which comes from abroad, but now when I'm at a panel like this, I don't know if I'm a Jew or a Buddhist or a Christian, because everything has a foundation, because in Hebrew, the sacred text is the Bible, but it comes from the Greek, biblos. Torah is used in the Hebrew community, and Torah means teaching, ora. So it's not a religious text per se. It's a book to teach humanity a way of living. So take, for example, that people read the Torah, but they study it word by word and letter by letter. The wisest ones who do a mystical study of the Torah study it letter by letter. For example, Genesis, the first word is Bereshit, similar to Brexit in Great Britain, but yeah, that's a Genesis also. But Bereshit, when we read Bereshit, we say Genesis, the beginning. But we have to analyze the word. So from the word Bereshit, we have three concepts. First, we have the word Rosh, head, then Bereshit, Esh, fire, and Brit. which means covenant. That's the way of studying. We also use our intellect, the head, the mind, rationality, but also the fire of the heart. So with this, we establish a covenant between the universe and humanity. Well, to put this into context regarding, well, most in the case of Islam, everything has been, all revelations from Quran have been transmitted orally, and well, the transmission had to be oral because many people knew how to read and write, but due to the linguistic difficulty, complexity in the Quran, these had to be done to learn it as it was written in Quran. One of the first chapters starts with 3 separate words, Alif Lam Mim, which are ALM, but they're separate. They have to be read as such, and they have no meaning at all, apart from their existence and how they sound. But the same words in a different chapter, which starts with the same letters, which is Al-Am, Alif Lam Mim, but together they form a word. So someone who reads will read the same way if the person just can read, but they're not similar. We have the first case, Alif Lam Mim, which it has to be memorized this way, and the second is Alam. It's the beginning of a question. So this is just an example to show that oral transmission is necessary. This is a personal experience in Punjab. I remember elderly people who hadn't attended school, but when they read prayers, they could do it for an hour. They hadn't attended school, but they knew a 40, 50 or an hour long, 45, 50 minutes or one long hour prayer, and I just couldn't understand it. So when I went to Gurdwara, I was listening, and they were interpreting the text. It was not a translation, but the meaning, the essence of the words. So that's what we feel when we understand what they're saying. It's more interpreting than translating. So this is my experience with elderly people. I was surprised that they could read and perfectly pronounce the words, the same as people who had 2 degrees. They could do it. And it's something that, as a child, had always was always funny. So yeah, that's interpretation or translation. That's what we see in Buddhism, like in religious texts. We have 3 lines. We have the Tibetan writing, then we have the phonetic depiction, because, well, many people can read Tibetan, but then you can see how it's pronounced, because the sound itself is important, how it's pronounced. So everything is related. It's important to establish a relationship between the words, body and mind, right there. So phonetics already allowed to create this relationship. So then, after the phonetic description, we get the translation. So if you can't read Tibetan, you can follow the phonetics and understand what they're saying. But obviously, it's quite a challenge because it's not just about the importance of understanding what you're saying. It goes one step beyond in these practices. It's about changing these conceptual framework. Maybe when you repeat a prayer, you get the impression that by force of repetition, it doesn't mean anything. But these breaks this conceptual perspective, which implies that you already know it because you're repeating it. But the mystical and spiritual character of these religions goes beyond that, beyond these prayers that keep repeating all the mantras that you have to repeat that don't mean anything, it's just a sound. This is also quite important in spiritual traditions, at least in Eastern traditions, to cut this conceptual element.
Yes, as the Germans said, on the one hand, we have the interpretation, because many people also pray in the Hebrew language, but they don't understand. So you can study and pray in any language. The important thing is to understand what you're doing. And there are also sounds and words. But as my colleague here was saying, it's not only about reading, because you can pray, as you say, for 1 hour or two, and then it becomes a routine. It loses the sense of the prayer. And when we saw that little girl praying in Sanskrit, it's the same prayer. We have a very similar one in Hebrew, and then there's this body language, and I just counted 7 times, which is the seven times, because it's not a coincidence, right? That's why we are humans, right? But it's important what we were saying about the interpretation. And what do I understand by interpretation? It's not only studying and praying. What we say from the study, we talk about 2 concepts. Torah, Abudah. Torah means study, and Abudah is work, action. So everything that is done has to lead to action. If we don't incorporate what we study and into social action, it is useless. So the objective of the creation of the human being is making a better world. So it is meditation and action. Let's join meditate action. So that's the objective. All religions have the same basis, and sacred holy texts are all based on the same. The Quran, the Vedas, the Sikhs books, the Torah, the Bible, they all have the same basis. The problem has been throughout these decades and centuries, mainly in the last 20 centuries, the task of religious people, which has been the leaders, those that rule, the rulers, of becoming hegemonic and confrontation. Instead of understanding religion as a spiritual practice, ceremonial of humanity, it was understood religion was, each has its own truth. Each one was like God, SL, or corporation, and whether it is called a mosque, synagogues, or whatever. Whereas before, the ceremonies were on the streets, open. So spirituality, the word spirituality, as Professor was saying, is ruach. Ruach, I think that in Arabic it means wind. And I think it's a good definition, spirituality and ruach. Scientific method, it's not tangible, and wind isn't, but we feel it. We feel the wind, and we also feel the spirituality, and we also feel the spirituality and the wind. It comes and goes, and depending on whether we want to be taken. If it is to have a world where there's no suffering, no hunger, or no inequality, so that everyone has an accommodation, which is like love the other as you would love thyself, or it is a figure. Figures also have reactions in the mind as 155. Well, I will add a different dimension of the roh that he was mentioning. In Arabic, it also means the soul. Roh. Rohaniyat is the spirituality, and therefore it's a question of experiencing more than repeating. But experiencing, in order to experience, you need some knowledge of what that means in order to react when you are saying one thing and you don't know what you mean, or if it hasn't been well explained. And some people have misinterpreted, because it's not easy in the case of Islam. And I will give you an example, interpreting the Quran. And lately, they say it should be reinterpreted, but not everyone is capable of that. So the same letters that I was mentioning before, some other three, mean two things. Depending on the symbols we would have on top or below. I don't know whether you speak Arabic, but if you know what a shakri, it's like the symbols, the small symbols that relate to letters. So the ya, nun daenna. If we say Dainun, we say loan. If we say Diyun, it means religion. So if the person is not able to, it doesn't have enough knowledge, might condemn someone saying that you have a debt that you haven't returned. That's just an example. Well, I see that as Jorge, we are all religions. It's like going to the airport. We can take Gran Via or Diagonal or another street, but the destination is the same. So what Mustapha has said, Rohaniev, in our language is the same. Spirituality, Rohaniev, is the same word. And when we talked about the interpretation, in the Sikhism, this doesn't happen to us because when someone speaks Gurbani, it is as if someone speaks Catalan knows the verbs. If you don't know the verbs or grammar, you won't be able to teach anyone else how the Catalan language works, or Catalan or any other language. So it is as if until you speak Gurmani, you can't interpret the text or translate the text of the holy text. If you can't make an interpretation, well, if you know, it will be done correctly. And this happens now, 20 years ago, or 100 years ago. Well, now I'm thinking that I don't know whether I think it's different of Buddhism and the other three traditions, because in Buddhism there isn't a holy text. It's a different concept. It is said that Buddha is the historical Buddha, but as an example of the human being can get to be. So the example of a human being who can discover what he or she is. And his comments, his teachings of what steps he took, and that provide like a reference, like saying, now you do it if you want. But then it's like there's not a holy text, but there are many different texts, volumes of instructions in order to of his experience, so that he can inspire you to make this transformation. It's an inner way of transformation for each of us. It's not of beliefs. from this perspective. But then what happened? It seems that it had always been oral. His discourse had always been oral, and it is said that 300 years after his death, they started gathering. Up to then, it had been like word of mouth, gathering his saying, and then there's a lot of controversy whether he said that or not, because we can imagine that this is a factor that is important to contemplate. Most religious traditions have originated in societies that were very patriarchal. We have to take that into account. So who made this collection of Buddha's words? It was men, of course, and they were monks. The institutions existed. Whereas in his times, this type of institution didn't exist. So this gives rise to continuously having a reading or reinterpreting of texts. Even a deconstruction, we have to put into question what has been said up to now. In order to convey this essence, does this language still serve? Is it useful, or it doesn't fit any longer? So all this work of reading and deconstruction of remaking the original, this is a dynamic process. That's why there are so many different traditions of Buddhism, because where it has arrived, it has adapted to society, to the society it found. So we have Vietnamese Buddhism, and now it has reached the West, and we need to do this work. I think it is different. I think it is different from your cases. Yes, very often as to words don't have the correct translation. They are translated literally, but not the concept. Look at, we all know that we have ojo por ojo and diente por diente. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But it's never said that in Hebrew. It's never said that. It was a wrong translation done by the Greeks. In fact, what the Torah says, which eye under the eye, tooth under tooth, which means in the concept, the large concept is that if someone, by accident or not, takes an eye off, you have to do, your eye will be under that eye, so that if that person with that eye sew or work the earth, your eye will be the substitute. So if that person work with that arm and you have made it useless, your arm will serve to work the earth, because then it's another harm. So see how concepts change. This was not said in the same we were saying about Adam in Hebrew. It's Adam with an M, and Adan in Catalan or Spanish, and Adam comes from dam, which means blood, and Adama, which is earth. So we come from the earth, but while we are living, the blood is our vital fluid. So words have this beautiful concept, and as he was saying, and sometimes the concept was made in a tribal and so the 12 tribes in Israel, Israel was because the last name of the patriarch, Yaakov and Israel. So from his children are the ones that form the 12 twice. But he had 13 children, and just go figure what gender was the 13th child. And well, but she wasn't allowed to create a tribe. And all religious figures are men. When this is Abraham, the great patriarch, or Moses, or Jesus, the Dalai Lama, there isn't a Dalai Lama, a female Dalai Lama, or Muhammad. There aren't any female figures. And I said, well, is he a god or a goddess? Thank you, Jorge, because this is something that, well, we are maybe not aware that I think it is very important for us to take into account. So in most religious traditions, we don't see the experience of the women. But, well, you know, in the spiritual, there isn't, well, any difference between females and males as far as spirituality is concerned. I mean, the way, the language is different. So I think it's good and that we should take it into account, because I think it is necessary, because religious traditions today, so for them to be alive and useful for everyone, they have to include the vision and experience of wise women in each tradition. They are there, but they've been silenced. So I encourage you to work, to do it, and to see who are them, and to give voice to all this experience from the vision, from the female view. And now, in a change of paradigms, etc., I think that it's very, very important for teachers, even if they are male, well, which is the contribution of women, the experience of women, sensitivity of women. We need that, because before it was a patriarchy, and now we are in a time when we would like to see some harmony and balance. So we need to balance ourselves, and in some resources that come from outside and can inspire us. And I think it is very important for religions to be self-critical and open, because they are not all open to the fact that the women's voice is incorporated. Just to continue along this line, how do young people live through it or experience this? How do they experience these practices with all these social changes? I would say that I should respond to feminism, because I think I've been the guilty one when I said that things should not be interpreted. Well, they should be interpreted and reinterpreted, but it should be done by the person who are fit, among them women, of course. And in Islam, the case of Islam, there are female figures that have been silenced, and one of them is the wife of the Prophet, who says, the one who narrated more hadiths about his life. And this is not known. Without her, we wouldn't have had what in the second source of legislation, which is the Summa, which is the life of the Prophet. Without her narrative, without her effort of interpreting what the Prophet did, we wouldn't have this occasion. But let me allow to go back to translation, because I think it's essential, especially when we talk about, in this case, about Islam and the Quran, certain holy sayings, as my colleague, Adam in Hebrew is translated into Adan. So these two things, in the Adam is Adam in the case of Arabic, but if we translate from Adan, Adan is a call to prayer. So here there's more confusion. Another concept would be Iman. So it is referred to the person who directs prayers with Iman. It's Imam with M at the end, because Iman, you're referring to the faith, because the faith is Iman in Arabic and not Imam. So these confusions are present, especially when there are relationships between Muslims who don't speak Arabic. And then I think that you understand what I mean, right? And we could talk about jihad. Before it was translated as just a holy war, which has nothing to do with that. In respect to the new generation, there's a lot of internal debate between a youth dynamic that demands parents to adapt to the reality, in the sense that they know a little bit the Catalan language or Spanish language in order to communicate with his or her children, because there's shortage in that sense. Not lack of interest, but the lack of capacity to achieve enough level to communicate in this religious level. But on the other hand, parents are also obsessed, Arabs or people who speak Urdu here, for people to learn the mother tongue in order to learn what they consider to be essential for their religiosity. So we have a debate here going on, and some entities have tried to organize some bilingual activities, Urdu, Catalan, Urdu, Spanish, in order to, try to find a middle way to answer the needs of both sides. Well, what we were saying about the women, when we talk about a country or any religion, when we talk about women, we say, oh, yes, equality. But then the thing is, if it's a country or a religion, the theory is always very nice. But then what about the practice? I always think that this is the difficult. I'm not saying that in Sikhism also affect coming from India, where there's a lot of male chauvinism. There's a caste, and without even the Sikhism refuses that, it affects, because we live in a society where this has a lot of power, with a population which is completely different, and we have a different philosophy than Sikhism. So when we talk about the role of women, when we go to presentation, and what about can women pray, and a Sikh wears a turban, and what about the women? Because those who have been in Urdu, the one thing is the society, the other is religion. We live in a society when there's a lot of inequality, but when we get to Gurudwara, a woman or a boy or a girl, a Catholic or Muslim, anyone who doesn't believe in God has the same right as a practicing Sikh, as a pope of the Sikhs. I'm talking about the practice because the theory is different. I'm telling you about the practice because we need practice, not theories. Because we don't, we change the world with facts. So here in Barcelona, our center is open to everyone, and they can do anything. A Muslim woman can do the same of a Catholic or Christian Jewish woman. Why? Because religions, as we were saying before, the universe is the same. We are the children of the universe. We are all brothers and sisters. So we have to be able to do what we feel. And as for new generation and the Sikhs, we are taken to a Gurdwara. We live experiences since our childhood. But when we reach at a certain age, at 10 or 12 or 14, no, it doesn't work like that. My great-grandparents were not practicing Sikhism. So in other religions, it's different. It has always been like that. I am a practicing Sikh, but in order to become a practicing Sikh, you decide it by yourself. I wear a turban. It's not because my because my parent wants me. So I have two sisters. One of them is a practicing one. And then if a religion is like a love, it's like the parents, like a couple's love. If there's no feeling, there's no relationship. If we don't have feelings towards religion, we can't force anyone's, because these feelings had to come from inside. So with the new generation happens the same. So they go to Gurdwara when a Sikh becomes older, feels with 15 or 20 or 30 or with 80, feel that he or she wants to become a practicing Sikh. Or it is the same as falling in love at any age, right? At 60, if you want to become a practicing Sikh, well, go ahead. Otherwise, nobody imposes that. If you are born in that religion, you have to be that. It doesn't work like that. Well, I think that because of time, we should be finishing. So I think you have 1 minute each for your last intervention before giving the floor, to the audience. Well, a quick summary would be that it's very important, the youth people today, because there are one generation or two who was very endogamic, and they made liturgy at the synagogue, and it was only for the liturgy. And it also made a generation to get farther away from religion, because there wasn't a relationship of love, but of obligation. It was more than love, it was repression. And today, there's a change to the future that we are making in the community. That is that youngsters first understand what they are doing, and that they do it because they want to, without being forced. But I think that it's important. There's a proposal that is being done, and I think that we have it all inside, and which is going to exist in the future. There is starting talk about interreligiosity among communities, among religious representatives. We have much more than good dialogue. We don't have prejudices. We go to a Buddhist temple, to a mosque. We are together. You know that here we go to hospitals, prisons. We are always together. When Linguapax introduced that, well, we embrace each other because we know each other, and this is beautiful. And tolerability and respect don't exist. There's coexistence. But we have to, we have to make youngsters to live religion. For youngsters, I said, bring your colleagues. And in their ceremonies, they come people from all religions, and they have to go to the other ceremonies, religious ceremonies, either if they are believers or not believers. They should live interculturality and in solidarity, so that they start to have positive actions, that they should see the pain of the city, of people who need care, committing them to practice religion, not to read it, but to practice what is beautiful about religions, which is, for instance, look in all religions, the word peace is open. Salam, Pau, Namaste, Shalom. The words guerra are war. Salam means peace, shalom, peace. When I say hello, I say shalom. When I say bye-bye, I say shalom. But I'm talking about peace. And well, shalom comes from the word salem, which means whole. When a whole has an interior peace, and all of us here have this interior peace to build a better world. Well, I would say that there's nothing else to add. Well, two things very quickly. Jorge is very easy to speak after you. Just want to add, just a marginal note to complement what you've said. The Islam prophet told his colleagues that he came here to complement value. He didn't invent another religion. Shalom comes from Salim, which is whole, and the Islam, its origins are two words, Islam and Salim. Salim means a whole in all senses, physical and psychological, and Islam is submission. In order to be whole in everything you want, you have to submit to Allah, in this case, God. Most Muslims prefer Allah in Arabic because it goes with the idea of the unity of God. So even if they speak Catalan or Francophones or Anglophones, they prefer to say the word Allah, So submission to God in order to achieve this wholeness or integrity, because if you follow the way, you will become whole. The second thing is to talk from feelings and experiences. If I'm not wrong, religion comes from relegare in Latin, which has 3 dimensions in Islam. And I think that most confessions, most beliefs, first relegare in yourself, not different dimensions, with yourself, with the other, and with transcendence. Very often we devote ourselves to transcendence, and we forget about ourselves and with the rest of people. Thank you. Well, we are late, and just one thing. We are born from the same essence, from the same light. There aren't any worse or better. We are all the same. And I always think when we get together like this with representatives from other religions, I'm very happy, because religions, all the philosophy in the world, show us for equality. It's people who sometimes don't do it right, and then society starts criticizing religions, not the person, but religions. So all religions teach how to love. And today we are each a flower, and we create a beautiful flower bouquet. And thanks to the Town Council of Barcelona, Generalitat, Linguapax, for having made this possible, because I've learned many things today. Before, when I used to live in Punjab, India, I only knew Sikhism and Hinduism, and I've got to know here other religions. I made friends, and I have interior and exterior knowledge, and it's very nice. Thank you very much. Well, along your lines, I just want to focus on all religious traditions. Well, everything they can contribute, and I think there's a dimension that right now in our society is essential, that we can receive it, but taking into account the context, as we have said here throughout the day, it's a society that is it's a great challenge for religious traditions, because let's not forget that we live in a secular society. So society, the secular society, of course, more than ever has a spiritual thirst, and that we may understand from what Jordi has been saying about so many centuries with a vision of reality which is so mechanic, and where the center are not the person, the individuals. And I think it's a need for society, is a real spiritual hunger. So religious traditions that are a treasure of a legacy, a heritage of wisdom. Well, it's nothing new. When you say religion, no religion. Well, we have this challenge of that every religion can extract what is really essential, what is fundamental, and then we can just leave away what is not important. Otherwise, there won't be a kind of match between our secular society and religious tradition. And each religion has to get away from ideas, concepts that surrounds this more essential dimension, which is a treasure, a heritage for our society to be conveyed. And thank you very much for having invited me here. Thanks to all of you. And
per la capacitat de síntesi, perquè...
Thank you for your summaries and, well, for being so concise, because we could be here for many hours. Now I'll give the floor to Núria Gallard and Enric Vendrell.
Hola, bon migdia. Ja.
Well, hi, good afternoon almost. I'm Núria. I come from the Office of Religious Affairs of the Town Council of Barcelona. I have 5 minutes to provide a snapshot. So I'll talk about the religious diversity of Barcelona that accompanies linguistic diversity. So our service is a municipal service which was created late or in the mid-90s and started consolidating in 2005. It's a service which has some history now. It's in the area of citizenship, participation and transparency of the Town Council, which tries to guarantee religious freedom, supporting entities both with the opening of religious centers and supporting their activities and the development of these activities, of course. In parallel, it also does dissemination and training on diversity, religious diversity issues, etc. So, essentially, in Barcelona, we count how many religious centers there are. In 2016, we had more than 540. More than half are Catholic, but people are not aware that the first minority here are evangelist churches. There are around 190 in Barcelona. So this is related to what you were saying, Mercè, what's invisible, because I'm referring to this issue of invisibility. Then we have Islamic centers, 29, so it's a big difference. And this is just to show or talk about this topic of invisibility and visibility, and talking about the public space, as was mentioned by Jorge. So essentially, Barcelona is a rich city with a lot of diversity. In this case, religious diversity, which we can see in all districts of Barcelona. Well, every district has religious diversity with at least 5-6 faiths per district, up to 12-13. So approximately there are between 15 and 20 different faiths here in Barcelona. Speaking in general, I'm not talking about their specificities. So the big challenge for the office now is to provide the space for religious diversity from the perspective of rights and the framework of laicism. And as Montse was saying, not understood as the absence of the religious from the public space, but a space of neutrality where all options of religious or non-religious belief can be present with the same rights, capacity, and equality. So from the office, we would like to thank you, well, both to Linguapax and the government of Barcelona and the regional council for inviting us. I would like to congratulate Linguapax for their 30th anniversary, and I would like to thank all of you, all the speakers, I would like to thank you for coming.
Passo la paraula.
Molt bon dia. La veritat és que portava
Okay, so
text preparat.
I had prepared a text, but I won't read it because it's late. Secondly, because I think it will be enough with sharing the ideas I heard during the morning. First, I'd like to congratulate Linguapax for this initiative, the session, and it's not just a rhetorical statement. I'd like to explain why I'm congratulating you, because I think that you decided to devote some hours to a topic which is really important now at this moment our country is living. As it has been mentioned previously, it's clear, as we heard in the first presentation by Jorge Burdman, I think it's clear, there's a clear idea that language and religion really conform a specific way of understanding the world. Language and religion finally conform identities in plural. So I am fully aware of this because I've been General Director of Religious Affairs for some years, and this is what I've seen firsthand in the country. But sometimes I don't really think that the country is aware of this, that we were talking about, that language and religion create identities. I get the impression, but I'm not an expert in education. The previous presentation was focusing on the role of educators and the teachers, and this is something very important, but our country is not really aware that language and religion conform identities. And maybe I'll be a bit provocative because we'll stop soon and we'll leave. So I'll leave it here, but I get the impression that our country believed that the children, the school children from our country, that will attend several different entities in our countries, and they have a social life as normal as any other kid, and they work because they've studied and they go into the labor market. We have eventually believed that this is what integration means and that there was no problem at all. And in August, we had a huge impact and many questions on the table. And in my opinion, the issue of identities in the country hasn't been fully resolved. So if we don't start dealing with this issue seriously, there's something which is happening now, which would take too long to explain. But as Montse Castellà has mentioned, well, the country is based on laicism, but it's more than that. Our country has lived a very important process of secularization. Now the religious is out of the public sphere. We have hidden the religious component, but now in the country there are different communities that make us face the mirror and tell us that language and religion conform identities, and we're taken by surprise here. So I repeat once again, congratulations for talking about this topic or focusing on this topic. We have to work on it, and we really need to face that there's not a real Catalan identity. The fact that we train or teach our children in our system and they're in the labor market, it doesn't mean that they have a specific identity. We have identities in our country, and they have to coexist. That's a big challenge. We have to allow identities to coexist. I'm not a catastrophist, but well, the fact that we can do it successfully or not will say a lot about our country. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we will move on to the conclusions. Maybe Alícia, very quickly.
si val realment la pena, perquè tothom...
Well, these are not really conclusions that we have agreed with the team. It's essentially a summary of the different topics that we have talked about. Maybe you should read the report, the Linguapax report on these sessions, which will include the different texts and the sessions that we have recorded. It will be a multimedia report with videos, text, with all the info from these 2 days. So just to close, to summarize, we have reflected on linguistic diversity on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of Linguapax. So yesterday we did an orthodox review of the traditional topics about vehicular languages and revitalization processes. We saw how vehicular languages presented by Professor Ostler, the lingua franca, which are quite controversial. Sometimes he presented them as a way to bridge the gaps between cultures, to try to, well, to bridge these gaps. And he was talking about the technological future in which these would be different, but it was interesting to hear Mr. Austin talk about revitalization, which in academy commits not just to file languages for documentation and the consumption by academy, but how communities of speakers commit to this process. He offered the nice image of the Engage Humanities program that he coordinated. This was an initiative of Community Humanities, that's a literal translation. He talked about those people in the botanical garden in the University of Leiden, how they were speaking, the example. He also focused on the bilateral transfer of knowledge, especially the involvement of the community, which is a quantitative leap from documentation to action. And he focused on something he mentioned, the effects between language and the welfare or health of communities, as Jorge Burdman has explained. Through the traditions he has talked about, Shalom, Shalem, or this Ramet, or this translation of peace, which sometimes is empty in our culture. We don't really know what it means. Sometimes it's only the absence of word, but it has a complexity which has to do with more. So we should review our salutations and saying hello in many cultures, which really have to do with the spiritual dimension. So there are many common threads between yesterday and today that we'll try to work on and to make explicit. After yesterday's session with Mr. Ostler and Mr. Austin, we have to connect both issues, how this increase of technology and the disappearance of lingua francas has an impact on the preservation of languages in territorial domains. So the presentation with by Singh Maconi was quite stimulating about languages in our cultural environment, focusing on the fact that languages, along the lines of what Jordi Pigem was talking about, this quantified world from traditional anthropology. People talk about the realm of quantity. That's the sign of the time. So instead of alternative linguistics, this also has a translation that has been suffered by many languages out of Europe that they have been quantified, administered from concepts and linguistic policies which are exogenous. So what we want to focus on the fact that Linguapax is not a research center strictly, but tries to be a bridge between research entities, researchers, and public administrations which manage these topics to improve the life of citizens and NGOs. So we will have accomplished our objective if these concepts have really permeated the different stakeholders here, academia, NGOs, government representatives through different departments or organizations. So all of us have to work on these ideas. So we saw that Singh Maconi said that every person does his or her own socio-linguistical voyage. Everyone follows his own or her own reflection from the linguistic or social-linguistic perspective. And we had also a presentation by monolingual models which really force the realities of many citizens. Well, we see how there are many linguistic personal voyages. Well, Mercè, this is what she has mentioned, the linguistic autobiographies. We heard about the representation of indigenous voices by Eddie in the digital environment, and he opened the perspective on this concept which has been floating around during the two sessions about how languages are not just the languages as we conceive them in conventional academia, but a language is comprised of many languages and many semiotic resources and communication experiences. So Singh from a distance talked about the communication modalities, computationally mediated, and essentially the summary is what I have mentioned. Everyone should go back to their prisms of reflection with all these ideas that we have discussed and what may come out of the ideas from the debates we have had, from the discussions we've had. So we'll be producing a report which will be more polished. I hope it's useful. So thank you very much.